All right, it's 8, so we can start. Thank you all for being here. I'm very happy that still some of you made the commitment to come at 8 p.m. The session tonight takes place in the context of a small project, Trust in Digital Markets, Keeping Tabs on Systemic Risks, and it's supported by the Faculty of Law of the University of Amsterdam and organized by the University of Amsterdam's Trust RPA, as well as also the DSA Observatory of the Institute for Information Law. My name is Linda Weigel. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Information Law, and I have the honor to moderate tonight's panel. But now let's talk about trust and power in platform auditing. Consider for a moment a scenario in which financial auditors had no common standards or definitions, only their own judgment to determine the scope and method of an audit. The findings would likely be inconsistent and hard to trust. This is the challenge we are facing with the first round of audits under the EU's Digital Services Act. The DSA is a relatively new EU regulation, and when the EU adopted this regulation, it aimed first and foremost at increasing accountability and transparency of the world's largest tech companies. In particular, this regulation is a first step in holding Meta, Alphabet, TikTok, and the like accountable for the risk that their services pose to society. I want to give some examples of these risks. So since Musk's takeover, we see increasingly how X continues to be a hotspot for spread of illegal hate speech. We also see that Meta's algorithmic moderation often suppresses posts from marginalized groups. And there's also, it's no secret that doom scrolling on TikTok or Instagram correlates with anxiety and dissatisfaction. Now, one really important mechanism here is the requirement for independent audits, whereby auditing firms not only evaluate these self-reported risk assessments and mitigation, but they also check for the compliance with general obligations. But here's a catch that I hinted to at the very beginning of this introduction. Even though there are some guidelines, we do not have any clear standards, definitions, and methods. But now, why am I telling you this? Why does this matter? And what does it even mean for us? Well, while financial audits are about trust in the economic system, DSA audits aim at something just as critical and by far no less important. They focus on identifying harms, which I would say many of us are exposed to every day. With the DSA, regulators want to turn this around, so tonight we're not talking about algorithmic auditing as this kind of narrow, technical, siloed industry practice. We have much more at stake. And doing things right is crucial for the effectiveness of the law and the liability, accountability of big tech that we longed for so long. And having said that, I'm very glad to have a really nice panel here tonight and moderate a nice exchange of thoughts to discuss these challenges of auditing platforms. So to come to our speakers, we have with us Marie-Therese Sequence, who's a PhD candidate at TU Delft's Institute for Technology Policy and Management and also Deputy Director of the AI Futures Lab. Her research focuses on content moderation, platform governance and regulation, AI, and socio-technical and legal systems design. We also have with us tonight Petros Tertsis, who is, after spending some time together with me at the Institute for Information Law, now incoming lecturer in digital law at the King's College London, and his work focuses on the regulation, governance, and political economy of computational infrastructures. And I'm also happy to have another special guest in the panel, Emre Kazim, the co-founder and co-CEO of Holistic AI, actually one of the companies who conducted one of the audits. Emre has a tenured background in AI ethics and governance, and he's also involved with NIST and OECD and holds a master in chemistry and PhD in philosophy from UCL and King's College London. Okay. So having said all that, I'm very excited to kick off the discussion and first hear from our speakers. If any questions come to mind to you, please, I kindly ask you to keep them in mind. We will have some time for Q&A at the end of the session. But I would say, without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to join you. So maybe, hello, yeah. Marie, can you maybe help us set the scene? So with the DSA, we're looking at a very complicated regulation and a multi-actor ecosystem, various interests in mind, and also a lot of vagueness, as I mentioned, to this platform auditing. given all this, what do you see as the main challenge in turning these audits into meaningful tools for accountability of big tech?
So maybe when we think about the audits, what is the thing that we look at when we look at an audit platform? So what is the process that we try to study, regulate, and document? So first you have a user that uploads, for example, a piece of content. Then maybe an algorithm like an AI decides if this is against the rules or against the law. Maybe then a human has to look for a second time if what the algorithm thought is right or wrong. Maybe then it goes online. Maybe then another user at the online platform thinks this is completely wrong and we don't want that on our platform. And then there are different other actors. So for example, maybe an NGO discovers that there's something that they think is hate speech and they inform the platform about it. And then there are the researchers, and then there are the regulators, like the European Commission at a very high level, or for example, the digital service coordinators at a lower level. So this might be, for example, the ARCOM in France, or the RTR in Austria. And this is what kind of the landscape in a very, very easy sketch that I draw for you could look like. The DSA is now trying to look at different risk categories when we talk about systemic risks, and we have 4 of them that we try to find in this process where we have already so many players, like the user and the platform, and regulators and the flaggers and the other users, and the experts and the non-experts. And those 4 risk categories are first, the dissemination of illegal content, something that is wrong with human rights. So for example, the right to privacy or the right to freedom of expression can come to mind here. And then we have something that is negatively affecting the electoral process, so something like, for example, disinformation. And then we have another paragraph that's a little bit mushy in my opinion, so that's gender-based violence and negative effects on the physical and mental well-being of humans. And if we think about those risks, like in this content moderation process, where can we even assess that? So the first thing where we could assess that is when it's uploaded on the platform. So everything that comes in that the platform sees, we could draw basically a status quo there and see what kind of risks do we have at this part? What kind of risks does the platform have to deal with? And then another thing is, okay, the platform did their job, like the AI looked at the content, and then also the humans looked at the content. And what is at the platform after they did their job of content moderation? And this might be something like ex post content moderation. And then we could assess at those 2 stages, do we find a lot of illegal content? Like, do we find terrorist content in the beginning before they did the content moderation systems? Probably way more than after the content moderation. So this is also a question, I think, like, where do we look for those risks? And then we have to think, the DSA regulates so many platforms, as you said, they all look different. So we look at something like Facebook, we probably all have a good view on what that might look like, but do we look only at the content, or do we look at the comments, or do we look at memes, or do we look at hashtags? And how do we define, like, where do we even have to find the problems that we then document in those systemic risk assessments? This is super complex, this is super challenging. Only like defining what illegal content is for me is super hard. So there could be so many aspects how you could think, okay, under Austrian and German law, you are not allowed to post Nazi content, and then you find that by a user that posts that from one of those countries. Okay, in my opinion, you have to delete it. But what happens if you have a user in a country that is not regulated there? Do you then have to delete it for the whole European Union? Do you have to geo-block it only for the countries where you have a provision that would cover that? So for example, Austria and Germany. So if you look at it in detail, it is really hard, it is really challenging. And then the DSA not only gives you those risk assessments, but only so much documentation on top of that. So you have to do transparency reports, that's basically like a balance sheet for an online platform where they have to show that once or twice a year. And then you have something like a register that gives you all the content moderation decisions on kind of a live daily basis. So this is the form of complexity that we see with a task like the Digital Services Act.
Yeah, thank you for that great introduction to all the reports and documentation that platform need to issue. So also for you to know, all of this documentation, like the systemic risk assessments, they're actually public, so we can all access them. We can all look at TikToks and Metas and Facebook's systemic risk assessment reports. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and also the topic of tonight, that there are some companies that need to then audit these reports, but also other obligations. And that is then basically, their findings are held in these so-called audit reports, which are also publicly available. Petros, I think you've looked at some of these reports, and I want to now move a bit towards implementations, and I want to hear from you your first thought of, when looking at these reports, what is your first impression? What do you think has worked or maybe not? Can you give your perspective on that?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much both for the context. It's important to understand what exactly we are dealing with here. And in short, I will just reiterate that what is at stake essentially is the obligation of a platform to be audited by someone, by an auditing company, based on the obligations that are introduced by the Digital Services Act. So, for example, the Digital Services Act imposes the obligation of designing a recommender system based on particular parameters and making sure that you give the user the ability to tweak these parameters and make their feed, their TikTok feed, suit their preferences. Now, an auditor has to audit whether the platform has complied with this obligation. So the idea is really cool. The problem starts when you have a look at the actors that got involved in the business of auditing. Now, algorithmic auditing and platform auditing is a topic that has a long history. Long before the DSA, people were designing different methodologies, computer scientists, lawyers, social scientists, all together, publishing papers as to how to evaluate platforms. Now, what it ended up happening is the Digital Services Act and another legal act that followed that clarified some aspects of platform auditing were created in such a way that promoted a certain culture of auditing. Long story short, out of the 19 platforms that were audited, 16 of them were audited by KPMG, EY, and Deloitte. Now, these companies have absolutely no background whatsoever in doing auditing, at least in the way the Digital Services Act want them to do. So to give you an example, the Delegated Act on the Performance of Audit, a piece of legislation that followed the Digital Services Act, wants the auditor to audit TikTok, for example, and its algorithmic system within the social and economic context that this algorithmic system operates. Now, if you go to an auditor, like a traditional auditor, like Deloitte, EY, or KPMG, and tell them to evaluate the social and economic context of an algorithmic system, they will look at you as if you speak a different language. Because these auditors, for what they are trained in a very specific kind of auditing and a very specific methodologies and culture of auditing. So what it ended up becoming, we end up with audit reports that are exceptionally difficult to read, comprehend, and analyze. They are long, almost unreadable documents, full of templates and tables and numbers. And even for someone trained in the profession of reading and understanding, like myself, it was a very difficult task to make sense of things. And yet, if you spend your finite time on this planet reading these documents, you can make sense of some things. And I think I brought with me together some of that, and the organizers were very helpful in letting me. I'm trying to make this work, but no, it did before, but now it doesn't.
Maybe we can just press.
Use the.
So I brought with me some examples of things that actually get to know through these audit reports, which again, as Linda mentioned, they are public, so you can read them if you have the stamina and the resilience, and see if you can if you can learn something. So, for example, we learned that. Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Thanks. So, again, the platforms must design their recommender system in a way that they give the users, like ourselves, the ability in an easily accessible way to tweak the parameters of the recommender system and make our feed look as we want it. Now, the auditor asked TikTok, how do you understand the term easily accessible? The TikTok replied, but then the auditor decided to redact this definition from the published version of the audit report for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Moving forward, the delegated act on the performance of audit, and one obligation that it introduces is that it tells auditors to publish the contract that they have with the audited organization. So if you are KPMG and you have audited TikTok, you must publish the contract between you between the KPMG and TikTok, and this is precisely what happened. We ended up having this sort of contracts annexed to the audit reports. So you can see that law, and I may make a radical point here, law is almost irrelevant on what it asks from auditors and the audited entities. Another funny thing that I found again in the audit of TikTok was the fact that every platform is obligated to offer users a non-personalized feed. So if you want, you should be able to access your platform of choice and opt for a non-personalized feed, which essentially means a chronological timeline. It may be difficult to find it amongst the settings because companies do not want a chronological setting. They want a personalized feed, but they are obligated to have a non-personalized feed. Turns out that TikTok uses actually location data even when you opt for a non-personalized feed. And this is because apparently TikTok understands non-personalization as not involving location, because location, for some reason that the lawyer at TikTok can explain, is not considered personal data according to GDPR. And finally, one thing that actually changed, and I tested it, and I think you can test it yourself, is the way X explains the ad that are delivered to your feed. So every ad in your X account has a small icon where you can find more information. Why am I seeing this ad? Now, 1 year ago, this message was saying you might be seeing this ad because X, Y, Z. And now it says one reason you are seeing this ad is because X, Y, Z. And this is because the auditor thought and advised that the language needs to change, and instead of saying you might be seeing this ad, now we are receiving the message one reason we are seeing this ad. Okay, you can learn this and see, okay, may things then change, and if you are on this camp, I would strongly encourage you to raise the threshold of your expectations. So yeah, the audit reports were exactly as they were expected because the big players, the big actors, Deloitte, EY, KPMG got into the game. And when these actors come into the market, in that case the market for auditing platforms, they come with a very particular, very strong culture of doing things that traces back to years and decades of doing things. And I don't know, we shouldn't be expecting Deloitte, EY, KPMG of the world to change the way they do things. But if they are allowed to keep auditing, this is precisely what the audit market will look like.
Thank you, Petros. Yeah, indeed. So we've had extensive discussions on these audits and systemic risks, and it's really difficult to apply this audit culture and these measures and quantifications to things like hate speech, gender-based violence, because they're, or electoral processes, because it's something that is not necessarily measurable and you can tick off in a box. Thank you for giving us this detailed insight. I think it's super interesting. Now, I want to move to Emre. We've heard about the law and the audits, but we've not heard about actually the insights from the industry. You are coming from the emerging industry with clients across EU, UK, and beyond. Maybe if I can ask you to give us a bit of an insight into the ecosystem, because at the end of the day, we are the outsiders, and you are actually part of, this system.
Awesome, thanks. First, it's just fantastic to be here, a real pleasure. Thank you so much for organizing this, and thanks to everyone in the team for putting this together. And it's great to see so much interest in this space. So just kind of by way of background, we're a company that spun out of research that we were doing at University College London. So UCL is the birthplace of DeepMind. So there was a real consciousness within the department that we gave birth to a lot of these children. We should probably be the ones that discipline it. So this problem of trustworthiness in algorithmic systems was really front of mind for us. And we were approaching this from a very, very different way to, if you will, the way in which ultimately what's taking place in the DSA has transpired. So we were interested in how do you audit or assess an individual algorithm. So if you've got an algorithm being used in a trading system or supply chain or in HR or whatever it is, marketing and so on and so forth, can we audit that particular algorithm? And our core thesis was that, hey, there are these kind of technical verticals, explainability, bias, privacy, robustness, and you audit those technical verticals against things like, mission criticality, reputational damage, impending compliance, and so on and so forth. So our core thesis was that you have a technical first order assessment, that you have a second order assessment, which is taxonomy of responsibility, escalation processes, documentation, who used it, and so on and so forth. And the idea was that first order and second order assessments would feed into what actually matters, which is what's the impact of the system. So platform auditing is way, way more complicated than what we were describing with a single system. And I don't think we do that third order assessment as a community, if you will, for a single system particularly well. Let alone how on earth is one going to go about doing an assessment of the impact, if you will, of a platform. So let me just kind of caveat that. Petros, I wish you had spoken your mind. We could have been more forthright here. But really what we do as a company is that. And we ended up doing one of the DSA audits. So just to talk about the kind of general ecosystem, what are we seeing? So there are different motivators within industry to get audited, if you will. So one clean reason is there's a compliance requirement. And I think we're going to kind of discuss this theme, and it's an open theme actually to the whole audience here and to my esteemed colleagues about, is compliance the mechanism by which we're going to deliver, if you will, responsible use or responsible platforms and so on and so forth. So that's one motivation. And the industry motivation behind that, typically we have a much more regulatory and active ecosystem here in Europe. So we see more of that kind of activity in Europe. In the US, where we also operate, what we're seeing is a little bit of the regulatory stuff, but actually what we're seeing more generally is a desire to say, what the hell is going on with these algorithms? So we've seen over the last 2-3 years that companies are undergoing a kind of race for AI. There's a kind of, every company wants to position itself as AI first. They want to signal to the market that they're undergoing an AI transformation. They're deploying significant capital in this space. So companies, big companies that do more than 20 billion were spending about $100 to $200 million on AI experiments last year. And there's a desire to say, how can we govern these kinds of systems? So it's a kind of non-compliance motivation to say, can we be confident that these systems that we're hoping to deploy in our business that have these huge consequential effects on the actual business itself, economic and so on and so forth, can we be confident that these systems actually work? So we're seeing actually a business motivation. which is not driven by, if you will, concern for demographic disparity or any of these kind of matters, but actually just core, if we're going to be using something that's critical to the business, can we be confident about that system? And on the other end of the spectrum, what we're seeing is, oh God, there's a compliance requirement. Can we ensure that we're compliant? I think where we are as a business, as an industry writ large, is we're still in the early stages. So I thought we would have been more mature by now. We were talking about this earlier. I thought that the decade was going to be structured where in the first 5 years or so until where we are now, middle of the decade, we would have got somewhere along the lines of reasonable accountability mechanisms, documentation regimes, taxonomies of responsibility. And then we expected over the second half of the decade to get codification of technical standards and best practice. I think we're still quite early on in this journey. And we're seeing different motivations. With the Trump regime, there has been a significant push to deregulate or to have less emphasis on that regulatory side. And it depends on what your political persuasion is. That's also having a knock-on effect here in Europe as well. So that's the kind of lay of the land. And I'm happy to kind of talk more generally about it.
Yeah, maybe one question to any of you, or maybe everyone can give a piece, is like, I'm seeing this stretch between, on the one hand, we have the regulatory demand set by regulations such as the DSA, where audits have to happen, and also the kind of like a normative or maybe idealistic thought of like, we want to have meaningful audits. We just don't want to have systems to be audited for the sake of it and to have this stamp on it that it has been audited, but we really do want to avoid these harms and these risks that algorithms and platforms pose essentially to society and individual users. So is there a chance even, because at the moment apparently it's really driven more by the regulatory demand, so is there a chance to kind of achieve their balance with the current system that we have in place, or how do you see that?
I can start maybe.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of optimistic view on what could happen with the DSA, and of course this is a future discussion and we will see how it's going to be. But I think when we talk basically in our research team about it, we see it a little bit like when you make pancakes and the first one is not a great pancake, but the next one is getting better and better. And I think we could have the same thing with the audit reports, with the systemic risk assessment reports, with the transparency reports, and with the trusted flagger reports. So there are also so many reports, and I think it's a learning thing that we also have to accept. It's not going to be great in the beginning, but I also think we have to push what we want out of this learning. So I think we have to really explicitly say, this is good, this is not good. We want something that changes aspects in, for example, how you explain your methodology sections in the systemic risk assessment reports and in the audit reports. You want something that's a little bit more researchy, so that we as researchers, for example, can cross-check in a later part and then have like a dialogue maybe between all those different actors. But I think it has a lot of potential, and I think it's a very unique piece of regulation where we should also be proud of that we have it. And I think we have a lot of challenges, like everything that we talked about is a lot of challenges that come with this regulation. But I also think that there is a lot of potential to make it better over time. And you were saying it's still young, so let's see how we can grow.
Do you want to say something, or? So what you mentioned also right now, when we're talking about building the pancakes and eventually arriving at the perfect pancake, I think what we mentioned before, a lot of the issues come also from this diversity of how audits are being done, right? Like some companies go into that, and I had this conversation with Petros. For Petros, they're all the same, the audit reports. But if you actually look at them, you know, some audits actually look at, some auditors just look at what the policies and terms and conditions says that the system does, and others go in and actually test them. So for me, that is actually a difference. But at the same time, this is driven by some sort of intrinsic motivation. But ideally, we would have some standardization, right, across that says this is a really good audit or this is a really failed audit, and therefore you're in a way liable or whatever, you didn't do a good job. My next question would be also to all of you. I've heard a lot about these ideas of we need some more guidelines and standardizations. Now, to my mind, comes oftentimes is like, does it really bring us further? Will it help us? Or also, given the vast amount of different industries and platforms that we audit. So, for instance, we have TikTok, but then there's also Zalando or Booking. They really do not face the same systemic risks and therefore probably different approaches, but we also need some sort of base. So, topic standardization. What are your thoughts on this? Do we need more or less? I think my impression was always more, but yeah.
First of all, just to touch a little bit upon the previous discussion, I think I don't necessarily agree with the argument that we are in early stages. I think we, in terms of timeline, we are in the early stages, but I think we are not. The timeline is not linear. We are setting the foundations, and the way the first audit reports will be done will essentially determine what kind of audits will be followed. So if we start commenting on how we can do audit reports better, we are essentially entrenched in a system where we have the same audit reports year by year with some incremental changes. I don't think that this is the best strategy moving forward, neither from a research nor a policy perspective. So we are not. I think the pancakes analogy is a bit false to the extent that the second pancake will normally have no leftovers from the previous one, whereas the second batch of audit reports will follow the same structure, the same foundations that the first audit reports have established. On standardization, every actor in the auditing ecosystem wants standardization. The European Commission wants to promote standards for homogeneous standardization. Auditors really crave standards to make their work more objective and more easily navigatable and defined. But I want to argue that standardization works for very particular actors. Standardization is good for those who want to templatize, if this is a verb, the process of evaluating how a platform works. Instead, I would argue that a far more generative exercise would be to imagine the practice of auditing a platform with no standards and no templates. How would our audit look like? How would our evaluation of how TikTok or Facebook works if we had no templates and just the Digital Services Act and the Delegated Act on the Performance of Audit and a blank sheet of paper? How would we go about this intellectual, methodological, and research exercise? I think this is a far more generative and creative way to spend our intellectual and financial resources rather than having meetings on how to create the one standard to rule them all.
No, go ahead. I want to hear.
No, it was just to say I absolutely take the point about path dependency. And you know, the way we're beginning, is it just there's no motivation if an auditor has gone through the first audit or has done the first audit and then they were not chastised by the commission. What reason would you have to radically do an audit in a different way, right? So there's a tremendous amount of path dependency, but I think it goes back to what do we want from the legislation? Like, what is it that we want from that legislation? And at the core is a normative demand, right? It is a reaction to, as a collective, as a political collective, it's a reaction to concerns that we in the collective have for things like disinformation. So the purpose of the audit, is it to say it has reasonable provisions with respect to disinformation? Or is the purpose of the audit to say, here's how the platform manages disinformation? And then it kind of throws the ball back into the political court to say, are we as a community comfortable with that? You know, is that a level of protection, or are there mechanisms that we think should be tightened or should be made looser? Because, for example, the question of the balance between freedom of speech and hate speech or whatever it may be is a politically substantive point, right? As in, people will have differences of opinion on that. And an audit can still be conducted insofar as X or Y platform, I mean X in the generic sense, said platform has such and such mechanisms of content moderation. Like, I think we would be in a thankless task if the audit becomes a normative audit, even if the DSA's route or motivation is ultimately normative. It's just that the auditor should not be the one who makes that decision, right? Sorry.
Yeah.
This is a question I can react, but perhaps we can
Please react.
I think, given the fact that the DSA has specific normative origins and specific normative mandates, if you will, it wouldn't be hard to imagine that the auditing will follow the same standards. If the Delegated Act on the Performance of Audits wants the auditor to perform their risk analysis based on the social and economic context where an algorithmic system is developed, then we shall expect that the auditors will do the job of evaluating the social and economic context of an algorithmic system. If they cannot do it, if they're not trained to do it, if they don't have this, the routines of corporate practice does not allow them to do it, then they shall not take a share of the market. Then another company, another startup perhaps can take their role in that. And there are many startups doing this job, as you know, Emre. And if they can take the onus of responsibility that comes with making normative claims out in the world and being judged by these claims, they shall be the ones who take also the job of auditing platforms.
Yeah, and maybe on that I was also thinking, like, if we depart from this normative ground and we go into fully descriptive audits in a way, or confirmative audits.
Or like transparency.
I think then we also kind of strengthen that issue of power concentration in a way, right? Because we're already in this precarious situation where we have the platforms with an immense amount of power, and then they hire auditors that do the audit for them. So there's a financial interest on kind of both sides to also, like a financial and then also reputational interest. And going forward, this might be also an auditor that just audits year by year. So you kind of build that sort of relationship. So I do think that there needs to be some sort of normative element in there, because otherwise we're just gonna, are again at the, it's some sort of like compliance, but it doesn't really enforce, I guess, the DSA in that sense. Any comment on that, or?
It's just like so it's codification of a normative impulse, right? Which is codified in the form of the DSA. And then the question is actually, is that given some of the subjects are just so contentious, right? We've seen it in the last few months, in the last year or so. Just earlier in our discussions, people were citing examples, and somebody cited an example, and it was interesting because they were citing an example of hate speech being in one direction, and then I was speaking to someone else who was saying it was the total opposite. So let's take about the Palestine-Gaza thing. You know, they were saying there was a rise in anti-Semitism, and then the other side they were saying, oh no, there's been tremendous amount of censorship on pro-Palestinian content. And it was just like, well, that is what's being judged there. You know, who's making that judgment? Like, I absolutely take the point that we are expressing our desire through our democratic mechanisms, and that has to be respected. But who's going to, like, do you see, if you're saying, well, if the auditor can't do it, then it should be somebody else. But then it begs the question of, okay, if there's a particular academic unit or group that says, okay, I'm going to go about and do this audit, they're going to be expressing if they end up making normative claims, aside from methodological questions, they will be expressing value, right? It's just that, and the claim would have to be that the value is synonymous with the value of the DSA. And lots of people would be challenging that claim. It's just, you know, I'll tell you, so I did my PhD in philosophy, I did it in ethics. And very early on, I made sure that we would not ever assure something as ethical or unethical. And I said, you know what, I'm not your priest. You know, like, as in these kinds of questions, I have opinions, strong opinions on this or that matter, of course. But like, it's almost like we can provide the transparency, and then, my God, everybody has a right to that debate, if you will. So that's where I'm really trying to understand how can we work it forward, you know?
Okay. Yeah, I think an interesting point also I would like to touch on tonight is in general, because we were talking about the different actors involved, right? And there is, I guess, also a role for research and academia to play here, and civil society. Where do you think should we find our place in all of this? Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I think there are many parts to be played, maybe. So I think researchers could be great in providing empirical evidence, providing evidence in general. I think something that could be better is, as we most of the time say, is probably something like dedicated funding to that, because this work takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. And I think this is something that maybe hasn't scaled up to the task that we would be facing if we would substantially contribute to evidence providing for the digital service coordinators and for the Commission. Another thing I also think is NGOs play a very crucial role. So everything that goes to user representativeness, so they can represent users according to Article 86 of the DSA, but also everything that is going towards trusted flaggers. Trusted flaggers is, for example, a new role under the DSA. They go basically out on an online platform and look for illegal content online, and then they collect all of that in a report, and then this is also like in the platforms have to report on that in the systemic risk assessment reports, and the auditors have to audit that, and then the trusted flaggers can also show that. So that's another role where we can contribute to empirical evidence on what is going right and what is going wrong. And then there are a lot of new user rights in general. So you have, for example, you said that already, so we have new forms of recommender systems, chronological recommender systems, and the user can choose if they want that, but also everything that goes into the direction of reporting mechanisms where you have to be informed if you report a piece of content and you say, oh, I think this piece of content, for example, is a copyright violation, or is it terrorist content or hate speech. And if you report it under the DSA, under illegal content, then you have to be informed what is happening with that piece of content. And the person who has uploaded the content has to be informed what is happening with the piece of content. And then we have user rights representatives also in the room. So then there is something like the out-of-court dispute mechanisms that also give a user a new right, which is basically something if you don't want to go to court, but you want to have, like you're not happy with the decision that the platform made. This is another form where you create like evidence that has to then go in the reporting structure that the Commission can check if the platforms did do that. The auditors can check if the platforms did report on that. So I think there are a lot of roles, but I also think, for example, having the discussion, bringing the people together, like to whom do you talk to if you, for example, as a researcher, write a new article that shows that, I don't know, something is wrong with platform XYZ, and then, like, where do you give that to? We don't have, like, channels where we can exchange this kind of new empirical evidence, these pieces of information, or maybe also if we find something that looks very wrong very early, to share that maybe as preprints or something that we did not publish already, but we want to shout out, hey, maybe you can have a look there. So I think that is something that could be quite helpful to establish for the future.
Yeah, I can follow up. It was really helpful for Mari to set the scene about the structural incentives that need to be created for changes and for enhancing the role of research in this field. So I think I can follow up with what I believe can be 3 different ways for legal researchers to navigate the field of platform auditing. The way I see it, there are at least 3 questions that can drive legal scholarship in this field. The one is to ask what we can do better. And if we ask what we can do better, we look at the audit reports, we look at the implementation reports, and we provide incremental changes on what things can change so as to have better audit reports next year. I think the opportunity cost is just too big to follow that research path, to be honest with you. I fully acknowledge everyone who has spent their time doing that and their resilience, but I think we shall not reserve a role for ourselves to teach the big auditors how to do qualitative research for public interest. We should not undertake this onus. It should not be our role to do that. So a second way we can go is to, as Linda asked before, how can we make meaningful audits? And this is, I think, a research trajectory, an intellectual trajectory worth pursuing, because it compels you to ask, okay, how would an auditing ecosystem would look like based on what the law says? And with all its omissions and flaws, the Digital Services Act and the Delegate Act on the Performance of Audit has set some foundations that lawyers and policymakers can use to establish institutional forms for auditing that can meaningfully provide information as to how platforms work and how they can change in order to make things work better for everyone. And a third, equally, I think, exciting and perhaps generative research question to ask is, okay, what have we done? What is the role of law in this space? And recently, the European Commission has alluded that they will be simplifying the GDPR, they will be simplifying the AI Act, and in this spirit of simplifying regulations, we need to confront perhaps the constitutive role of law in creating a highly unequal ecosystem, an ecosystem where the big players can enter the market and establish their own way of working. Law has played its role. It's not that law is just black and white and we interpret it as we please. The way some of the provisions of the DSA and the Delegate Act and Performance of Audit have been designed kind of created opportunities for actors to establish their own routines and culture. And I think understanding that, reflecting on the role of law, on the constitutive role of law in this ecosystem, perhaps can give also a reality check on what the responsibility of lawyers and legal researchers is in this field as well.
Emma, do you also want to add?
No, I was just agreeing.
Yeah. Okay, I have a last question before we go into the Q&A. Actually, it connects to also one of the points you mentioned, and I was asking before about the meaningful audits. At the end of the day, I think the ecosystem is like it is right now, and the articles are what they are. So, and the players are sort of fixed. So next year there are gonna be new risk assessments and new audits. And I think you mentioned, it's maybe not our job as researchers to tell auditors how to audit, but I still wonder if we were to give recommendations, for instance, to the Commission or to auditors still, so when I look at these risk assessments, they were quite disappointing, but also I think the expectations were rather low as well, that platforms wouldn't necessarily disclose something that we already didn't know. At the same time, I still hope that it did lay the ground for some more transparency, and maybe that the next years would be, or the next reports would be conducted more in a way that they feel scrutinized and be looked at. I'm being a bit vague now, but my question, I think, essentially is, for the next year, what do you think, is there any way we can influence somehow to have some sort of more trustworthy risk assessment and also audits that we can work with? In a way maybe also related to, now I'm getting a bit legal, but Article 40 that will allow us also as vetted researchers to access some of the data that platforms use to actually perform their risk assessments. Any thoughts, any final thoughts on that before we go into the Q&A?
I think like something that I would really wish for is, at the moment, so many of those mechanisms, like there's not only the audit reports and systemic risk assessment reports and transparency reports. Like, if you look at all of those different mechanisms that we get out of the DSA, I think it's essential that we orchestrate them. Like, they have to align. Otherwise, auditing that is very, very hard. I think that is like low-hanging fruit, but pretty important one. So that would be, if I could make a wish, consistency in how we connect all those dots that the DSA gives us would be really important. And that, to your point, to Article 40, the vetted researchers. So basically, as a researcher, you get better, more access to the data. It's basically like, if researchers could have wished for something, it would always have been Article 40 to do their research on online platforms. So that is the promise that the DSA gives us. This is why we are all so excited about. If it would work, we would get the data that we then can really look deep in what is going right and what is going wrong. However, it's still not here. And I think when we also think about connecting all those different reporting dots or reporting pipelines that we could do as researchers, as NGOs, from outside, data access would give us the look under the hood. So that would be the interesting part where, like, for example, the DSA has the statement of reason database. This is the basically like live log on content moderation decisions on online platforms. And if you could have data access and then look, okay, which content moderation decisions did Meta do on one day before the election or something like that. If you can log that and then maybe, for example, see if an auditor looked at the same time frame before an election to assess the risks on negative effects on the electoral process, then this could be super meaningful. I think this is where we should go and what we should wish for the future of auditing and compliance under the DSA.
Thank you. Any further thoughts?
If I advised the European Commission at this stage about what we can do to make sure that the audit reports that will follow are better than the ones we had, perhaps I would firstly say to read again what they had voted for. There are specific provisions in the DSA and the Delegate Act on the performance of audit that the auditors have completely neglected. And so with a clear mind, I think if we read what the law expects auditors to do, we will create a whole different picture than the one depicted in the audit report. So that will be the first thing. Read again the legislation. The second would be to stop any initiatives on standardizing any sort of auditing templates, because the more we standardize, the more we create a culture of having a very objective, not objective, but very narrowly scoped, highly descriptive audit reports that ultimately offer nothing to the researcher or to the public in general. And thirdly, perhaps from a policy perspective, I would like to see initiatives to support skills development for people to become active in how to audit platforms. I want to see a hub for NGOs and startups to build the skill set necessary to audit big platforms. And to go back to one of the questions that Emre left hanging about what is normatively demanded, I do not imagine a normative standard based on which all audits should be operated. I imagine an ecosystem of 20, 30, 40 different auditors, each one with their own normative underpinnings, easily expressed on their audit reports, and then let the marketplace of ideas decide whose normative claims are better and whose not. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just close by saying I just totally agree with the impetus or the force that ultimately, if the research community or let's say the non-audit community, by sheer force of intellectual activity and publishing and communicating, can effectively force the entire industry to act in accordance with, let's say, it may not be a single monolithic approach, but just say general trends or approaches. It would just make sense. Like, a recommender system would have had to have undergone at least X amount of tests, or could have been analyzed in a few thematic ways, and so on and so forth. So I think that's probably the only saving hope. From our perspective, it's, publish. I think we've got papers in the pipeline on our findings and our reflections on the DSA. And that's it. You know, ultimately, we have to take control over that thing. I talk as a researcher in that sense, not as an auditor. And ultimately, it will be an expression from a particular interest group in society, which is researchers are an interest group, but you know, probably more representative of the general will than you know, some of the parties that have been bashed here and there on the panel.
All right, thank you. Okay, so to just wrap up some of the points we mentioned, so Emery, you said also there's like the clear audit scope of what's objectively auditable in a way, and it shouldn't go towards more normative judgments, right? Petros made really clear we should stop standardizing things and also invite more actually stakeholders into the ecosystem. And I think Marie also mentioned really the importance that there is still value in the documents we have, if there's some sort of traceability and comparability in the future. And of course also the access that we would have as researchers also to this data would make a great difference to the trustworthiness and credibility of platform audits and platform research. Now, I want to open the floor to the audience. If you have some questions, we would be still happy to address those. Don't be shy. Yeah, I see you. Maybe you? Maybe you can just also mention who you are and to whom the question is addressed, if it's
yes, okay. My name is Maarten Sprenger. I've been working at an IT company, EdTech startup in educational search engine technology. I was a content curator there. I know a bit about things. You work from a positive side mainly. I was a well-paid mechanical Turk, you can say. And what I always wonder about audits in general is how do you know which code you are reflecting on? Because I really distrust big tech. So I think they can fool you in any way they like, but you're not stupid, of course, yourself. So what measures do you take and how does it work? Can you work with a live thing as such, or what do they offer you?
Is that addressed to me?
Yeah, sorry, it's mainly addressed to you. I'm looking at you, but maybe, since it was very interesting from all the other perspectives, I like very much to know what your opinion from the others is.
Yeah, so we approach it very much from a technical perspective, and one of there's a virtue and a vice to it, right? I mean, the vice is that ultimately, what do we actually care about? Generally, it's the impact, right? That's ultimately what we care about. But it feels a little bit strange to be able to do an assessment of a system without having interrogated the technology itself. So that was our kind of core hypothesis, which is it's necessary but insufficient to be able to do the socio-technical side. From our perspective, one of the things that we kept on getting was, there was a famous example in the UK where a parliamentarian asked YouTube why his video was removed. And they were like, it's a black box. We've got this algorithm. It's a black box. And we were like pretty quickly saying, no, that's probably not true. I mean, in fact, we know that's not true, right? As in, they have a system, they have a system, content moderating system. There is some reason why it was triggered. There is explainability around that system. And the explainability is, at a first level, technical. So we were very much interested in technical explainability. So from our perspective, it's more, with LLMs, explainability has changed. So there it's more to do with prompts, and you just test against a certain kind of outcome. But it's still very much technical. It's very technical. So it's not so much that they would game us by saying, here, you won't be able to see the technology. If it's got to the point where we're seeing it, then we probably are seeing the technology. The gaming is more around the control over the narrative, which is, oh, these systems are impossible to control, or they're all black box, or actually that's not the concern here, or we're looking at things at such an aggregate level that it's impossible for us to know how an individual system worked. So the gaming, if you will, is more on a higher order level than it is on, let's say, technical assessment.
Thank you. There was another question right there.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. Hanna Roschemeyer, University of Hagen. What do you think about the risk of regulatory capture? It has been discussed in the literature before, full disclosure also by me. That's why I'm interested in this particularly. You touched upon this a bit when you were mentioning the power concentration. So the rather underwhelming reports were no surprise to me. In addition, I think compared to 2 years ago, we also have the geopolitical pressure. I mean, the big four are all from the UK, but still, of course, there are consulting firms from the US who have interest in this business. What do you think about this, since enforcement has been more politicized than ever? I think it's a question for everyone. Thank you.
You want to go first? I think it's a real phenomenon, and we are witnessing it happening real time also in the space of auditing. I think I have squeezed another slide. If we can open this up to it's the last slide, I think. Yeah, that one. So here's, I think, is a perfect example of regulatory capture. This is recital number 8 of the Delegated Act on the Performance of Audit that explains what exactly independence of the auditor essentially means. The DSA says the auditor needs to be independent from the audited platform, and recital number 8 of the Delegated Act explains what this independence actually means for the context of law. And on the left-hand side, we see the draft version of this legislation. On the right-hand side, we see the actual, the final version of the Delegated Act. It's all the same, but there is a final sentence that reads, "This should not exclude auditing organizations who have performed statutory financial audits." Now, who are the entities that have performed statutory financial audits for potential big platforms? These are the big four. Right? So you see here how an explicit account of regulatory capture. But what I think is far more perhaps obscure is the implicit, the regulatory capture that happens without necessarily institutional actors getting sense of it. So, for example, with the first batch of audit reports coming out, then instantaneously we have discussions between the European Commission and Deloitte, EY, and KPMG on how we can make these audit reports better, right? So we have established the precedent that these will be the actors that they will be doing the audits, and now we work with them to make things work better. This, for me, is another example of regulatory capture that should not be left outside of our scope. And to finish with the question then becomes what we as legal researchers expect from our kind of routine and our work and our publications, given the state of regulatory capture in this specific field, but also more broadly. We cannot, in other words, treat law as something that is just neutral out there going and taking a life of its own, but rather a product of actions by multiple social and institutional actors.
So let me kind of give a counter-argument, which is, it feels to me that there is a political appetite to punish some of these platforms, rightly or wrongly, probably rightly. And the platform is saying, okay, you know what, how am I going to mitigate this reputationally, financially, and so on? I'm going to pay a lot of money to a big consultancy. Like, all the incentive structures are there. You know, so, and then we come along and say, oh no, they went with a startup. So what do you mean? So you spent a fraction of the cost you would have spent with a large, you know, so there's like, let's play it the other way around, you know, and say they're going to say, hey, these guys do financial audit, these are extremely credible. You know, this is going to be their arguments, right? And say, we spent a lot of money, we went to these big consultancy firms. We would be in a paradoxical situation where the argument would be saying to them, no, you've done really well by not going with, by have not spent so much money, and by not have worked with a large consultancy, which is going to be their very defense when they you know, they say some kind of action is taken against them. So it's not so, in a way, the whole, I think we spoke about it earlier in the workshop about legal design. That like all the incentives are there for the large platforms to do that, to take those very actions. So it would have to be a change from the legislative side, if you will, rather than, because that's the structural problem that I'm struggling to see. How can it not become, How can it not move in this direction?
And then maybe one last thing for that is also like, as an auditor of the big auditing firms, like probably like the first audits are pretty tricky, but then it gets easier and easier. It's like the more clients you kind of get in. If you look at the structure of the audit reports, like for example, if I think E&I has a page on sampling, that's basically like the text of the delegated regulation on sampling. I think it's Article 12. That is the same for all the platforms. So you have your templates, you have your standards. So they are standardizing a lot in what they put out, and I also think it's a shielding argument to go with a big firm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, yeah, there in the back.
Yeah, I really like the discussion about the standardization against the normative audits for algorithms. If you take a look at financial audits, there's like this universal set of guidelines that people appeal to, and it's even like a universal language at this point. And then for algorithm auditing, the variables are more qualitative in nature, so it makes sense that it's otherwise. But then there's also the issue of how auditors communicate with each other, and there's like this huge documents that get published, but people don't read or cannot understand as simply. I was wondering if there's a movement towards maybe not templatize audits, but maybe operationalize them, like maybe models or equations which can make the work easier for people to communicate with one another. I think the question is addressed to everyone, maybe Emily in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, by being, so it was funny to see the redacted reports. You know, it is funny to see just everything getting blacked out. And again, there's probably rational reasons for them to do that, you know, until, you know, you want to disclose as little as possible in an audit. You know, and nobody wants to get audited in that respect, right? So it depends on the pressure that can be applied on disclosure. So I guess in order to avoid the problem of it becoming templatized and so on and so forth, is to push for transparency, but as a mechanism of stimulating a broader, let's say, ecosystem of actors that contribute to audit methodology or audit approaches and so on and so forth. So it depends. So it's funny because we could end up with the opposite, where we maximize the transparency and then we just get one way of doing it, and then that just gets replicated across the board.
And one thing for standardization, I think that's actually a great question. I think it's a very complex question, because in some cases standardization is great. So one thing that I'm always complaining about is when I look at the transparency reports and they all give me like different accuracy measures, and there's basically like no report that takes the same. So how should I compare different platforms who have like at least similar kind of content? So I'm not comparing the Zalandos and the TikToks or something like that, but maybe YouTube and TikTok or something in that way. So for that, standardization would be super helpful. Or if I look at a platform that has basically like the same user size in a different member state, and to look at how many content moderators do they employ in a language. So for that, I think there's a lot of potential to look at standardization measures. For some parts, it's going into the checkboxing and making everything like easy to evaluate in a way that we don't want to get out probably of the DSA. But I think like looking at the different provisions in detail and then deciding like, yeah, okay, maybe we can do something here, or maybe there are also like some groups of platforms that we can kind of cluster where insight about this in a standardized way would be helpful. Maybe that could be like a next step.
Thank you.
Can I ask a subsequent question?
You have a follow-up? Yeah.
Yes, maybe if we don't standardize it straight, but maybe like turn it into something more operational, like maybe not set guidelines, but maybe like a toolkit for auditors to use. How would it look like?
Yeah, I mean, one example is how would you audit? And this is where it goes back to our competencies. That, yeah, it's you can look at real research and publish this as, like we did this a lot with debiasing of algorithms. So we just published all these kind of libraries of methodologies of just how would one approach it. So you just be kind of throwing the tools out there, and then depending on the context, you would apply it, right? So there's a kind of big open source community. There's a lot of impetus there, and there's a lot of motivation to contribute to that community. So that's one way in which you could absolutely do it. You could be kind of saying, hey, look, there are these different approaches. We did that quite a lot with bias, as a community. I suppose you could do that with other areas. Like the recommender system is a very good example of that. It is really to do with the will, So it's funny, I've been thinking a lot about, recently, all the frontier models were trained on everyone's data. They just consumed. It was like they've just totally obliterated our commitment to privacy. But it doesn't seem to be a problem. Like there is, you know what? It just seems to. It's almost like we shrugged it off, So a lot of this stuff is like there are real concerns. Like should people on platforms be exposed to heinous images, obscene things? No, like people don't want that as a society, And that's what's being expressed in these kind of legislative actions. And if it becomes commoditized and formulaic, then it just becomes that tick box exercise. So it's a lot of it is to do with the will from the top and from the bottom, So we really believe in open source and publishing things and putting libraries out there. And that's just more generally about what's our appetite to care about this kind of thing, if that makes any sense.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Do we have any further questions? Yeah, John in the front.
Yeah, thank you for this. Thanks for such an interesting panel. I wanted to ask one thing, and then I somehow landed on this other thing, which is maybe kind of basic and maybe even naive. But Petros, you were talking about kind of thinking not in terms of an agenda for what can researchers be doing, and that our job shouldn't be, or anyway, the opportunity cost is too high to be really telling these auditors what they can be doing better. But we've been with this auditing term, and like algorithmic auditing, we also talk about adversarial auditing. I think Ada Lovelace put out sort of like a taxonomy of different kinds of algorithmic audits that could be done. And we see this work being done by civil society organizations, by researchers. For example, a sock puppet audit, where you can set up an account which is looking like a 13-year-old girl or something, and if you click on something that has to do with nutrition, within 5 minutes you're being, led down rabbit holes of, anorexia, content, bulimia, eating disorders, so forth. And you can basically do this for any number of types of experiments. And so we see that these systems, for whatever reason, can push users in this or that direction. And it doesn't have to be a sock puppet audit. I mean, I was at CPDP recently, and somebody in the crowd, there was a panel on gender-based violence, and she was saying, today it's 1 o'clock now, and I, posted something on social media this morning, and I already have 6, hateful comments on my page that, this is by any measure illegal. What's being said, they're saying, calling for, violence against me and stuff like that. And this is just a reality. So I'm being a bit long-winded, but it's somehow in this whole conversation around auditing and compliance checks and this and that and the other, it's like somehow we're not getting to this basic fact that we understand that these platforms, have certain kinds of effects, that users are impacted in this way, and it's happening, at scale. And so how do you go about trying to sort of crack that puzzle? Because there's no shortage of research which is pointing to these issues.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think there is the risk of, and I'm using the term risk, of using the term of audit, I think, can be harmful in the long run on how we go about evaluating how platforms work. I think precisely because the DSA named it as audit, we ended up in a debate, in a legal debate, in a policy debate on how we can make sure that audits can work better, on how do we go about auditing platforms. If we have chosen different terms like evaluation, assessment of platforms, social investigation powers for certain legal entities, this is a completely different institutional, this can lead to completely different institutional formations. Discussing various methodologies of how to perform auditing can really shift our attention away of the real and the experienced harm that the platform causes. And I think there is room in doing audits in a way that that can surface that. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the Delegated Act on the Performance of Audit has explicit provisions on meaningful methodologies for doing the audits, like sock puppet audits as you described, that can by themselves lead to interesting findings, most of the implementation, precisely because it was undertaken by actors that have absolutely no background whatsoever in performing algorithmic auditing, ended up being a process that was essentially performed by conducting walkthroughs. Now, this is a term used in all audit reports. We conducted walkthrough to evaluate TikTok's compliance with this. Walkthrough essentially means I open an application, I pressed different buttons and see what happened. And they did this because this was essentially what the maximum that they could do. They have no competencies and skill set on doing things differently. So one, the terminology is important, and we need to make sure that the words we use, the concepts we develop, are not of the auditing profession. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be terminology that traditional auditors are familiar with. We should not play this game, and we should not develop the language according to what traditional actors are trained to deal with. And the second is we should not lose attention to the real and the experienced harm that we encounter day to day from our daily use of these applications.
Can I quickly defend the walkthroughs? I think for some provisions, the walkthroughs are super good. Like we have done walkthroughs, heuristically walkthroughs, if you want to know exactly, for reporting mechanisms. And if you want to test if a reporting mechanism, which has to be on an online platform according to Article 16 of the DSA, then the DSA says the reporting mechanism has to be user-friendly and easy to access. And then we were like, great. Fuzzy definition, user-friendly and easy to access. What is that? And then we were asking interviewees, like NGOs who represent users, like about disinformation topics or about hate speech, who help them to flag content in cases of copyright infringement or something like that, and regulators. And they were like, we have here like a wireframe of how TikTok implemented their reporting mechanism under the terms of service, like their contractual framework, and under the law. And then we have the same thing for Facebook. Is this user-friendly, or is that not user-friendly, and is this easy to access or not? And I think for something like that, if you really look at usability and design interfaces, walkthroughs, pretty helpful.
I need to clarify, you're absolutely right. I don't want to decrease the value of walkthroughs by no means as a method of evaluating the compliance of an application or making sense of how a platform works, essentially. But you cannot go too far with the walkthrough. You need the nitty-gritty. You need the how the recommender system work and how, not just how the parameters are set, but also how they are performed and what are the reasons behind the selection of these parameters. And this cannot be taught, it cannot be observed, investigated by a mere walkthrough. And I'm saying obligations that are enacted in the DSA. The DSA says that you need to be open about the parameters that you use in your recommender system, and you need also to explain the reason why you have chosen these parameters. And this cannot be done by a mere walkthrough. You need interviews. You need qualitative assessment of what's going on. You need constant engagement, observation with the audited organization. Things that traditional auditors are not neither trained, not very much willing to do. Which I return to my main point again and again. We should not allow the culture of traditional auditing occupying the space of platform auditing.
I just quickly, I just want to just echo, let me say, the moral force of what you're saying, John. You know, which is, we've got a situation where somebody, after 2 or 3 clicks, is being given instructions and self-harm. I mean, like, that's the elephant in the room, right? Ultimately, it's an unacceptable state of affairs. Like, it's a moral force that we are saying we need to act on this. So, like, if that, you know, if it becomes formulaic, if it becomes, you know, then it's just like, you know, great, you know, it can tick this off, but it's just unacceptable. You're like, it's having fundamental impact on our consciousness, on the formation of our minds, even as adults, as fully formed adults, on the vulnerable. I mean, fundamentally, what is the point, right? Ultimately, that is what we're concerned about. That's what I meant by it coming from, there's just too many, there's just, in a way, there's so much capital behind these platforms that there's just sufficient amount of experience in using legal redress and mechanisms to get yourself around it, that probably the only way in which you can really motivate this is through quite a lot of political and social pressure.
Yeah, Matthäus.
Thank you for the discussion so far. My name is Matthäus. I'm a PhD researcher from the UI in Florence. So 2 points. The first one, precisely because of that elephant in the room and what John talked, why is there an hesitance on so-called politicizing this? Isn't there kind of a normative awareness of all of this that is going on? We all know it. We talk about it. You just mentioned it. So there's a certain normativity. Maybe it's not on the side of the audit, but I'm not sure if it is the auditors that are making these calls, but there are normative commitments in legislation that we cannot, right, we just gloss over. That's the first one. And then the second one is more generally, there is a clear also normative commitment both in the DSA and the delegated regulation on audits on this being a socio-technical project and process, and not just a technical process. So I agree that there are a lot of problems with the design in the law. We talked about it earlier, but I don't think that that absolves us so that there's nothing to do. Still within that framework, there's something that could be done better for at least these processes to be socio-technical. And we go back to methodology, so on and so forth. So my question is, and this is, I guess, the big question is, what can the regulator do? Is it increasing the pushback or pushing back a bit more regarding the audits themselves? Or can they use, for example, the proven expertise? So in the delegated regulation for audits, can they scrutinize who gets to audit the platforms? So the expertise that the platforms have and the skills that they have to do systemic risk management in the way that has been normatively envisaged by the regulation. So could this be kind of a way out where before going into the audits themselves, you look at this proven expertise clause, which is in Article 37 of the DSA, and is repeated again in the delegated regulation, and kind of the Commission tries to make sense of this. So I ended up making 2 questions, I'm sorry, but yeah.
If it's not procedural, then it will be politicized. If it's politicized, then each camp can make counterclaims which are ostensibly as valid as the other. That group is left-wing, that group is right-wing, you're suppressing right-wing, you're suppressing the left. I mean, that's the problem, it's the democratic problem. Like, unfortunately, human beings have to live together. You know, so like, I don't know. Like, there would have to be sufficient political will to move it in a particular direction, if that makes sense. And actually, it may not be on, it could be to do with sovereignty. Because that's something which communities could unite it in. You know, as a European community, we could unite in the problem of sovereignty in terms of actual meaningful oversight and control over these platforms. That could be you might have to invoke different kinds of political principles or normative claims to move the agenda in a particular way, rather than, let's say, freedom of speech or harm.
Yeah, I think maybe I also just want to mention one thing that's also related to John's approach, and we're already at the half hour. I think what's also the sad news in that is that we have actually also facts about the harms, and it has nothing to do with politicization It's simply, we know the amount of mental health issues we have because of doom scrolling, right? And discrimination is also not necessarily always a political issue. It's also a fact, or censoring or then promoting or excessively amplifying certain content. And my main issue also here is that we have, for instance, for the risk assessments, Recital 90, but correct me if I'm wrong, where it is really recommended for platforms to engage with stakeholders and consult researchers and consult independent parties. And I think for the auditors, that's not necessarily prescribed, but I think it would be really interesting also for them to look at the facts, because then otherwise we audit things away, and we kind of audit also facts away in a way. So I think it would be also a really interesting approach to incorporate those actual findings and confront platforms with that. But again, then maybe we wonder, is that necessarily the task for the auditors to do, or the European Commission? I think that's, yeah, a lot of questions are being left unanswered, but more room for research, I guess, and discussions.
It's always how you close a paper, right?
Exactly. If you don't know, then it's a new avenue for research.
Other questions?
Anyways, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you, panel.
Linda.
It was a really, for those of you who don't know, we've been here for several hours talking about auditing. I also want to thank my colleagues Sophia and John for putting the entire day together with me. It was really fun. It was really nice. Thank you all.